What happens when those sworn to uphold the law become its greatest betrayers? When the judge's robe, a symbol of supreme justice, conceals not impartiality, but cold calculation and greed. These aren't just crimes. They're stories of trust weaponized and of shadows engulfing the light in the holiest halls of justice. Richard Baumgartner of Knoxville, Tennessee, was a respected criminal court judge with a long career on the bench. He presided over some of the region's most high-profile and emotionally charged cases, including a horrific capital murder trial that had captivated and horrified the community. He was seen as a steady hand, a sober arbiter of life and death decisions. But behind this facade of judicial composure, Baumgartner was living a double life, consumed by a secret that would ultimately invalidate his life's work. The judge was addicted to prescription painkillers. His addiction spiraled into a vortex of corruption that compromised the very core of his judicial function. He began buying pills from a probationer under his supervision and had a sexual relationship with a woman who was a participant in a state-run drug recovery program he was overseeing. His actions were a catastrophic conflict of interest. The motive was not greed in the traditional sense, but the desperate, all-consuming need of an addict. He traded his integrity, his power, and his oath for a handful of pills. The Knoxville News-Sentinel extensively covered the scandal as it unfolded, revealing how the judge's personal demons had directly infected his professional life. In 2013, he pleaded guilty to official misconduct and was sentenced to 6 months in jail. The consequences, however, rippled far beyond his own fate. Dozens of his convictions, including the one in the aforementioned capital murder case, were overturned, forcing victims' families to relive their worst nightmares in new trials. When a judge's personal failings become a poison that infects his own verdicts, how can the scales of justice ever be truly rebalanced? In the 1930s, a time of economic turmoil and social uncertainty, Martin Manton was a titan of the American legal system. As the senior circuit judge of the prestigious United States Court of Appeals for the Second Circuit, he was one of the most powerful jurists in the nation, just a step below the Supreme Court. His courtroom in New York was a place where landmark decisions were made, shaping the laws that governed millions. Manton, however, viewed his powerful position not as a sacred trust, but as a personal gold mine. He ran his court like a corrupt marketplace, systematically soliciting bribes from desperate litigants who came before him seeking justice. The price for a favorable ruling was steep, with Manton amassing what would be millions in today's currency. His corruption was audacious, a sprawling enterprise where he sold his vote on the judicial panel. The motivation was pure, unadulterated greed, a desire for a lavish lifestyle far beyond the means of his public servant's salary. The details that emerged during his trial were shocking, revealing a man who had completely abandoned his ethical compass. As federal court archives show, his case sent shockwaves through the nation, a deeply unsettling revelation that corruption had reached the highest levels of the judiciary. In 1939, the once mighty judge was convicted and sentenced to 2 years in prison and a substantial fine. The sentence may seem light by modern standards, but the impact was seismic, a stark warning about the corrupting influence of absolute power. If justice can be bought and sold in one of the nation's most revered courts, where does one turn for a verdict that is truly priceless? In the municipal courts of Ohio, the cases are often small, but the impact on people's lives is immense. A traffic ticket, a minor dispute. These are the everyday interactions where citizens most often meet the justice system. Judge Michael McGann of Ohio's municipal court held power over these everyday moments. He was a local figure, a man whose decisions could mean the difference between a hefty fine or a clean record. But McGann saw these small-stakes cases as a personal opportunity. He transformed his courtroom into a toll booth where justice was available for a price. His corruption was petty in its scale, but profound in its implications. He solicited and accepted bribes to fix cases. taking money to reduce charges or dismiss tickets for defendants who appeared before him. It was a systematic abuse of power, a slow and steady erosion of public trust for personal enrichment. His motive was simple: street-level greed. He exploited the fear and desperation of ordinary people caught in the system, turning their minor legal troubles into his personal income stream. As reported by the Cleveland Plain Dealer, his arrest was part of a broader federal probe into corruption within the local Ohio courts, codenamed Operation Wrinkle, which exposed a network of bribery and case-fixing. In 2007, McGann was convicted and sentenced to 2 years in prison. His case served as a stark reminder that corruption doesn't always live in high-stakes federal cases. It can thrive in the quiet, overlooked corners of the justice system. If even a parking ticket can be fixed for a bribe, what does that say about the integrity of the entire structure? Edward Devitt was a federal judge in Minnesota during a period of national soul-searching in the 1970s, the era following the Watergate scandal when public trust in government was at an all-time low. He was the chief federal judge for his district, a position that demanded the highest standard of ethical conduct to help restore that faith. Devitt, however, became an emblem of the very problem. He was a man who, behind the closed doors of his chambers, engaged in the kind of backroom dealing that shattered public confidence. His corruption was centered on civil cases, the legal battlegrounds where fortunes could be won or lost. Devitt accepted bribes not from notorious criminals, but from litigants in these civil disputes, promising them favorable outcomes in matters like real estate and business conflicts. His motive was a calculated greed, a decision to sell his judicial influence to those who could afford it. The Minnesota Star-Tribune reported on the federal investigation that uncovered his crimes, revealing a pattern of misconduct that had tainted the civil justice system in the state. In 1976, he was convicted of corruption and sentenced to 3.5 years in prison. His downfall was a stark illustration that judicial corruption is not limited to the criminal courts. The scales of justice can be tipped in any legal arena where power and money intersect. When a judge is willing to decide who wins a lawsuit based not on the merits of the case, but on the size of a bribe, what value does a legal right truly have? Harry Claiborne was a man of immense stature in Nevada, a brilliant and flamboyant defense attorney before becoming a federal judge. He was known for his sharp mind and larger-than-life personality. His appointment to the federal bench was seen as the crowning achievement of a storied career. From his seat in Las Vegas, he presided over cases in a city built on high stakes and shifting fortunes. But Judge Claiborne's own high-stakes gambling was not at the casino tables, but with the integrity of his office. He was convicted in 1984 not for taking a direct bribe in a specific case, but for something just as corrosive: felony tax evasion. He had filed false tax returns, concealing more than $100,000 in income he earned from his private law practice before becoming a judge. While he maintained the omissions were the fault of his accountants, the prosecution painted a picture of a man who believed he was above the very laws he administered. His motive seemed rooted in a profound sense of entitlement and arrogance. The New York Times documented his trial and subsequent historic impeachment. Claiborne became the first sitting federal judge in American history to be imprisoned, serving a 2-year sentence while refusing to resign his lifetime appointment. This forced the U.S. Congress to undertake the rare and grave process of impeachment and removal from office. His case became a national spectacle, a debate about judicial integrity and arrogance. When a judge is convicted of a felony and yet clings to his office from a prison cell, what does it say about his respect for the institution he represents? Robert Aguilar was a federal judge in the Northern District of California, a region at the heart of technological innovation and immense wealth. Appointed to the bench in 1980, he was a respected figure in a powerful and influential court. His position gave him access to sensitive information and the power to shape high-stakes legal battles. But Judge Aguilar used this access and power not to serve justice, but to serve his own interests and those of his associates. His crimes were a complex web of influence peddling and obstruction. He was convicted in 1990 for illegally disclosing the existence of a secret FBI wiretap to a former mobster, and for attempting to influence the case of another federal judge. Aguilar's actions were a betrayal from within, using his insider knowledge as a weapon against his own government's investigations. The motive appeared to be a tangled mess of ego, a desire to maintain powerful connections, and a misguided attempt to help his friends, even if it meant breaking the law. The Los Angeles Times covered the trial extensively, noting the rarity and gravity of a federal judge being charged with interfering in FBI matters. He was sentenced to 6 months in prison and fined. His case was a chilling reminder that a judge's corruption isn't always about taking a direct cash bribe. It can be the more subtle, but equally dangerous, crime of leaking secrets and obstructing justice. When a judge becomes an obstacle to the truth instead of its guardian, who is left to protect the integrity of the system? Michael Conahan was a man of immense power in Luzerne County, Pennsylvania, a charismatic and imposing figure whose influence was woven into the very fabric of the community. He was the president judge, a position that commanded respect and deference. But beneath the veneer of judicial authority festered a cold-blooded calculation that would shatter thousands of lives. In a scheme that became infamously known as Kids for Cash, Conahan and his colleague, Mark Chiavarella, orchestrated a conspiracy of breathtaking cruelty. They were the architects of a shadow economy built on the suffering of children. For $2.8 million in kickbacks from the owners of private juvenile detention centers, Conahan ensured a steady stream of new inmates. The crime itself was a monstrous betrayal of trust. He wasn't just a passive beneficiary, but the key facilitator, using his administrative power to shut down the county's public detention center, thereby creating a captive market for his co-conspirators. The victims were teenagers, some as young as 13, sent away for offenses that barely registered as youthful missteps, creating a parody MySpace page of a school principal, trespassing in a vacant building, a minor scuffle at school. These children stood before a judge, expecting justice, and were instead treated as commodities. The court became a marketplace, their futures the price of a bribe. In 2010, Conahan was sentenced to 17.5 years in federal prison. The New York Times reported on the staggering scope of the judicial misconduct that led to over 4,000 convictions being overturned. The scandal left an indelible scar on the community, a permanent reminder of a time when the system designed to protect its most vulnerable became their predator. When a judge's ambition is so vast that it consumes the futures of children, what hope remains for justice? Mark Chiavarella cultivated a reputation as the tough-on-crime judge of Luzerne County, Pennsylvania. He was known for his zero-tolerance policy in the courtroom, a public persona he wore like a suit of armor, projecting an image of unwavering moral rectitude. This image, however, was a grotesque mask for a man engaged in one of the most depraved judicial scandals in American history. As the judicial partner of Michael Conahan in the Kids for Cash scandal, Chiavarella was the face of the operation in the courtroom. He was the one who looked children in the eye, often without their legal right to an attorney, and sentenced them to months in private detention centers for the most trivial of offenses. His courtroom was a theater of cruelty, a place where due process was discarded in favor of profit. The psychological toll on his young victims was immeasurable. Lives were derailed, families were broken, and the trauma of being unjustly incarcerated left permanent scars. Chiavarella's motive was a sickening blend of greed and a chilling lack of empathy. He accepted millions in kickbacks, a fortune built upon the stolen innocence of minors. During his trial, the defense argued the payments were a finder's fee, a claim the prosecution eviscerated as absurd. CNN reported that upon his conviction, he displayed little remorse, a final act of arrogance from a man who had played God with children's lives. In 2011, the gavel finally fell for him, delivering a sentence of 28 years in federal prison. His punishment was severe, but for the community he terrorized, it could never fully erase the damage. How does a society reconcile the image of a protector with the reality of a predator who wore the very same robe? Reggie Walton was a judge in the municipal court system of Mississippi, a position that made him a powerful figure in his local community. He dealt with the daily churn of misdemeanor offenses, traffic violations, public intoxication, minor disputes, the kind of cases that form the bedrock of local law and order. To the people who entered his courtroom, he was the ultimate authority, the man who held their immediate fate in his hands. But Walton viewed this authority not as a public service, but as a personal revenue stream. He ran his court with the predatory instinct of an extortionist, preying on the very people he was sworn to serve. His scheme was brutally simple. He would solicit cash payments from defendants in exchange for promises to dismiss their cases, reduce their fines, or ensure a favorable outcome. This was a direct transaction. Cash for justice. The motive was a straightforward and cynical greed, an exploitation of his power over people who were often vulnerable and lacked the resources to challenge him. According to the Clarion Ledger, his corrupt practices became an open secret, a stain on the local judiciary until an investigation brought his reign to an end. Court records from Mississippi detail his systematic abuse of power. In 2005, Walton was convicted of extortion and sentenced to 3 years in federal prison. His case highlighted a pervasive, low-level corruption that can silently erode public faith from the ground up. When a judge demands a cash payment to make a legal problem disappear, is he dispensing justice, or is he just another shakedown artist with a gavel? John Murphy was a federal judge in New York City during the 1980s, a turbulent era when the city was grappling with the pervasive influence of organized crime. He was expected to be a bulwark against the mob, a figure of judicial integrity in the face of rampant criminality. Instead, Judge Murphy became one of their greatest assets. He chose to align himself not with the law he had sworn to uphold, but with the very criminals he was meant to sentence. His chambers became a gateway for corruption, a place where justice was secretly negotiated with mafia figures. The crime was a direct assault on the rule of law. Murphy accepted substantial bribes in exchange for leniency, ensuring that dangerous members of organized crime families received lighter sentences or favorable treatment. This was not a passive acceptance of a gift. It was an active partnership with the underworld. His actions were exposed as part of a wider federal investigation into judicial corruption, a probe that peeled back the layers of collusion between the bench and the mob. According to records from the Department of Justice, his case, United States versus Murphy, became a landmark example of the deep-seated corruption investigators were trying to root out. The motive was a simple, yet profound, betrayal, a thirst for money and power that overshadowed any sense of duty. In 1983, he was convicted of racketeering and sentenced to 10 years in prison. His fall was a chilling illustration of how the shadow of organized crime could even darken the halls of federal justice. When a judge effectively joins the ranks of the mafia, who is left to guard the city from its demons? Walter Nixon was a man who had reached the pinnacle of the legal profession. As a federal judge in Mississippi, he was entrusted with interpreting the highest laws of the land, a guardian of the Constitution itself. He was respected, established, and held a lifetime appointment, a position of almost unassailable security. Yet this high office became the stage for a profound betrayal, not of complex financial schemes, but of the fundamental principle of truth. Nixon's downfall began with a favor for a friend whose son was facing drug trafficking charges. Instead of recusing himself, Nixon stepped into a shadow world of influence peddling. He spoke to the prosecutor about the case, a conversation that would later become the subject of a grand jury investigation. When questioned under oath, Nixon lied. He committed perjury, the very crime he had likely sent others to prison for. The motive appeared to be a toxic mix of arrogance and a misguided sense of loyalty to an associate over his oath to the nation. He received illicit gifts, including lucrative oil and gas royalties, as a reward for his intervention. As reported by the New York Times in 1986, his conviction for lying to a grand jury was a stunning fall from grace. He was sentenced to 5 years in prison, but the ultimate consequence was yet to come. In a rare and dramatic process, Walter Nixon was impeached by the House of Representatives and removed from office by the Senate, a permanent stain on his legacy. When a federal judge, sworn to uphold the truth, sells that truth for personal gain, what foundation is left for the law to stand on? These cases force us to confront the nature of power and the temptations it brings. They show that no status, no robe, guarantees moral integrity. They're a reminder that the justice system, like any human institution, is vulnerable. And its protection is the responsibility not only of those who wear the robes, but of society as a whole. How can we, as citizens, fortify the bastions of justice so that the shadow of corruption never falls upon them again? How do we restore trust where it has been so brutally betrayed? Share your thoughts in the comments. What do you think about these shocking cases? And what mechanisms of accountability could prevent such tragedies in the future? If this video made you think, please like and subscribe to our channel to stay updated on new investigations. Thanks for watching.